So welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Laura and I am the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Our mission at the Interfaith Center is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate an appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. So today we are talking with Janja Lalich, who is an internationally renowned speaker on cults. And Janja, if you don't mind telling us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this type of work.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Well, when I was 30 years old, I got recruited into a cult. It was a political cult. We were going to, change the world and get rid of racism and sexism and all the isms. And I spent about 10 and a half years in that group. It was very restrictive. We worked 18, 20-hour days, 7 days a week. Anyway, when I got out, I had already, obviously, I was 30 when I joined, so I already had a college degree and I'd lived in Europe some. And while I was in the cult, one of my jobs was to build a publishing house. So I sort of taught myself publishing and learned a lot about it, went to publishing fairs. And so when I got out of the cult, I decided that my best bet would be to move to New York and hope to get a job in publishing. The cult was headquartered in San Francisco. And actually, I should add, we all got out. What was wonderful was that we finally had our revolution and we overthrew our leader. And so we, at that point, there were about 120 members and we were all free. So we helped each other with jobs and resumes and things like that. Anyway, I moved to New York. I felt like a 16-year-old, 40-year-old. I felt like I didn't know how to do anything. I had been, I was in New York, this cultural mecca. I had seen maybe 3 movies in 10 years. I felt like I didn't know how to talk to people. I was like I'd landed from Mars or something. So eventually it's too long to go into the whole story, but eventually I decided I needed some help and I found a therapist at the time. There was a cult clinic in New York that the therapist there specialized in cult recovery. And I started reading and there was practically nothing at that time about political cults. So it took me a while to even accept that I had been in a cult because everything I found was about religious cults. And I'm like, well, we weren't religious, so I guess we weren't a cult. So I had to go through all that. And my tendency has always been more intellectual in writing. So I started researching and writing and I wrote an article and then I wrote some books and I made connections with people working in the sort of cult awareness world. And eventually I moved back to San Francisco and I went to graduate school and got my Ph.D. And through all that time, I ran support groups and worked with families and wrote a few more books and, did everything I could to help educate the public, which has sort of been my mission. And I guess it's 2.5, almost 3 years ago now, I retired from my job as a sociology professor and I've never been so busy. So it seems like the world is suddenly either taken over by cults or everybody's interested in cults and wants to make a documentary about cults. So here we are today. So that's kind of how I got here.
Thank you. I know that you've written several books on the subject. One of them is called Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships. So I do want to get into the connection there, but before we do, could you tell us just a little bit about how would you define a cult?
Sure. I think someone asked the name of the cult I was in had a lot of names, but the background name was the Democratic Workers' Party, but we had a lot of front groups with different names. So how I would define a cult, for me, there are four, and that's four basic characteristics. The first, of course, is the authoritarian leader who is considered to be charismatic, who is usually a narcissist and some kind of power-hungry person. And that person has some kind of pitch that he's offering to take you to some salvation, whether it's political, religious, economic, weight loss, whatever. This guy or gal has the promise and he's the only one that can take you there. And secondly is what I call the transcendent belief system. And this is basically a belief system or an ideology that has the answer to everything, the past, the present, and the future. So it gives you a new way of looking at the world and looking at your role in the world. And a specific aspect of the transcendent belief system is that you're required to go through a personal self-transformation in order to be accepted on the path. And that transformation process is, of course, the indoctrination. And then third and fourth, we have what I see as, what I see as interlocking systems of influence and systems of control. So the systems of control are the very obvious rules and regulations, things you can say or do or not do. What sometimes it might be what you can wear, what you should wear, how you should talk, where you should live, how many children you should have or not have, et cetera, et cetera. Very obvious sort of rules of the group. And then the systems of influence are the more subtle kind of psychological and emotional manipulations that are used to get you to conform. So this is basically preying as in P-R-E-Y, preying on your guilt and shame and love and fear and anxiety, all those things that are normal human emotions, but basically manipulating and twisting those so that you will conform to who the cult wants you to be. So essentially, what we have is what I call a re-socialization process. You're being re-socialized into this nice, perfect little cult member.
Gotcha. So I think we're hearing you say that not all cults are religious is part of a misconception.
Absolutely. Excuse me, it's allergy season here. Excuse me. No, not all cults are religious. And I get asked this quite a bit, like what's the difference between a cult and a religion, or aren't all cults religious, or aren't all religions cults? And the answer is no. So for me, the distinction is, please excuse me. The distinction is that a healthy religion is not going to have you worshiping the human being in front of you, right? The physical person in front of you, the pastor, the preacher, the priest, whatever, right? The shaman, the whatever. And a healthy religion is going to perhaps give you guidelines for living, like, be nice to your neighbor. If someone moves in the neighborhood, take them a cake. Help your neighbor if they are in trouble. But they don't check up on you and see if you actually did that, right? Some religions may seem more strict, like the Catholic Church has probably more restrictions than a lot of religions. And yet, and they tell you, oh God, I'm so sorry. They tell you not to use birth control, but they don't come into your bedroom and check if you're using birth control, right? So there are those distinctions, whereas a cult is going to be much more restrictive, much more confining, and be the only answer, the only way, whereas a healthy religion is going to accept that there are other religions, there are other belief systems. They may think theirs is the best one, but they do acknowledge that there are other belief systems.
Okay. And you also mentioned that often there's a very charismatic leader. Could you talk a little bit more about those leaders and what traits do they have, and how might start to recognize those traits, or that someone could be coercive in their behavior?
Right. So first of all, I want to explain about charisma, because there's I think a widespread misunderstanding that charisma is a character trait that is inherent in an individual. Like that individual is born will grow up to be a charismatic person, right? And that's not accurate. Charisma, as first identified by one of the founding sociologists, Max Weber, explained that charisma is a social relationship. So what that means is that you, the follower or the believer or the person who is in awe of that person, you have basically attributed that person with charisma. You're the one who's saying that person is charismatic, right? That's why, some people might think, I don't know, they might think Donald Trump is charismatic, whereas others would say, oh, good grief, no. Or some people might think former President Obama is charismatic, and others might say, good grief, no. Because charisma is in the eye of the beholder. And because of that, because it's a social relationship, and because you are the one who attributes that, you then give that person power over you. It's a relationship with an imbalance of power. So right from the get-go, that person has power over you because in your mind, they're an esteemed individual. And then those who, there are obviously good charismatic figures. I mean, Martin Luther King, Jack Kennedy, whatever. But the ones who become cult leaders or who are narcissists and have narcissistic families or relationships, they then focus more on their own needs. It's the narcissism that takes over. And so they use the charisma to get their needs met.
Okay. And you mentioned the word narcissist, and that's a real hot button. It's a big topic that I keep seeing all over. People are talking about it. Why do you think that we are seeing suddenly this big conversation happening around narcissism, and how does all of that relate to, or how might a relationship with a narcissist mimic a relationship with a cult?
Yeah, there certainly has been a lot more attention to the whole idea of narcissism and narcissistic personalities and narcissistic abuse. And, gaslighting, which is one of the features of a narcissist. They're going to get you to think you're crazy. And I think the interest came nationally, and I don't mean to ruffle any feathers here, but I think the former guy, as they call him, who ran our country for 4 years, was a classic narcissist. And I think that started the public conversation about narcissism, and then people recognizing it elsewhere in their lives, whether it's their boss or their mom or their dad or their partner, male or female, although narcissists tend to be primarily male. And I guess that has something to do with how we still raise boys these days to think they're the superior ones. So narcissists, as we know, are all about themselves. That's all they care about. They're absolutely ego-driven. Everything's about me and what's going to please me and what's going to serve me and what's going to help me, and in whatever form that takes for that particular individual. So for some, it may be flashiness, like Bhagwan Rajneesh, the Indian guru, he had 93 Rolls Royces. I mean, who needs 93 Rolls Royces, right? So they're going to, exploit and manipulate and use the people they have under their fingers to satisfy their needs. And unfortunately, that relationship often is extremely traumatic. And the kind of trauma that people experience is very similar to what happens to cult members. And so the recovery process is also very similar in terms of looking at those kinds of power imbalances, the ways in which you were made to give up yourself, doubt yourself, not trust yourself, all of those things that happen while you're in a cult often happen equally in narcissistic relationships.
Mhm. Okay. So within spiritual communities, I know there are lots of, the smaller communities that aren't necessarily religions, but they're small groups that have leaders. Most groups do have leaders. What are some things that a person might look for to recognize that, hey, maybe this isn't quite right, or if someone has that feeling, does it necessarily indicate something is off? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, before I answer that, I noticed there's a few people on here who I know who are friends or colleagues of mine. So I'm not going to say your names, but I see you out there and I just want to say hi and thank you for being here. Some of the warning signs. Well, first of all, there is on my website, which is janjalalich.com. My name is spelled there on the thing, so it's all one word, janjalalich.com. I have a checklist for sort of evaluating spiritual groups. And also in my latest book, Escaping Utopia, there are a number of checklists for evaluating groups. But I think the things to look out for are certainly if you ask questions and your questions aren't answered. A typical cult ploy is to turn your question back on you, right? Or to tell you, you haven't learned enough yet, or come to a few more classes and then you'll understand. And of course, after a few more classes, you forget the question, right? Or if there's not transparency, both financial transparency as well as decision-making transparency, like how are decisions made? What's happening to the money? Where is the money coming from? Where is the money going? How are decisions made? Is the group democratic? Cults certainly are not democratic. It's very top down. And so, yes, there are leaders and there may be levels of leadership within a spiritual community or a religious community, but there should be ways to hold people accountable. There should be checks and balances. And so I think those are probably some of the main things that may not seem quite so obvious. Telling you what to do or where to live or to give up your children. I mean, those are going to be obvious flags, but sometimes the less obvious ones are the ones you think, oh, I guess I really shouldn't ask about the money. Yes, ask about the money, so ask whatever you want and feel satisfied with your answers.
Okay. Do you notice that in your research and in working with people who have been through, coming out of a cult and talking to them, does there seem to be any commonality in who is susceptible to a cult and to kind of getting into these situations?
Who is susceptible?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody. So let me explain. I've been doing this for about 35 years now. So I have met lots of people from wealthy families, from poverty families, from East Coast, West Coast, around the world, all kinds of backgrounds, good families, neglectful families. If there's any common denominator of who gets into a cult, it's idealism, right? It's people who want to make a better world, people who want to perhaps have a better family, have a better life for themselves, have purpose, have meaning, right? And these are all basic human needs. This isn't some, obsessive neediness. We all want that and need that we're social animals, right? I mean, some of us maybe more than others, but we all want to think there's some reason we're here, and we all need to find a framework for understanding the world. So you might be looking for that. You might be at what makes a person maybe more susceptible is if they're at a vulnerability point. And we are all at vulnerability points thousands of times in our lives, right? Being vulnerable is not a sickness. It just means that at that moment, you're just not quite settled, or you're a little bit shaky, or you're maybe a little bit curious, right? It could be you just moved to a new town, you just graduated from school, you just got divorced, your dog just died, it's raining out today. You know, it can be anything that just makes you a little off. And if that moment somebody comes along, or you see something on the internet or on a bulletin board in a coffee shop, or I guess that's kind of passe, but showing my years, but you know, you see something that speaks to you at that moment, then you might take that first step. So 2 points I want to make. The pitch of the cult or the recruiter has to resonate with you. It has to be something you're interested in, right? Just like one person's charismatic to someone, but not to someone else. Well, the pitch has to make sense to you. So for example, I always say, I never would have joined a meditation cult. I can't sit still that long. But a political cult, hey, sign me up, right? I was raring to go, right? So I want to make that point about the pitch has to resonate with you. And it's important to recognize that more than 2/3 of people who get recruited into cults are recruited by a friend, a family member, or a coworker. So what does that mean? It means it's harder to say no to someone you know. So you get invited to a workshop, you get invited to a meditation session, Uncle Harry invites you to his Bible study, whatever it might be. And you've said no so many times, you just can't anymore. And then you go once. Once you go once, the cult recruiters are very good at what they do. And if they think you're a target, they're going to love bomb you and try to get you to commit to come back to something else. And that's how it goes.
Gotcha. So I know in some of your work, you've really taken it beyond just what people might think of as a cult. And you've mentioned that there are religious groups, and then there are political, and then in the business world, there are culty companies. So can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like?
Sure.
From a corporate standpoint?
Sure. A lot of this started because of the impact of the New Age movement and the self-awareness movement of the 60s and 70s. So what we had at that time were what we called large group awareness trainings, right? So we had groups, I see some faces going, we had groups like Est and LifeSpring and Sci World, and Est turned into Landmark, and you know, and then there was this one and that one, and they just were a jumble of names of these weekend workshops, and then 5 days, and then a week, right, that you could go to that's just going to transform your life. And that phenomenon seeped into the business world like nothing you've ever seen. And so businesses were sending their people to these workshops. The government hired these people to train their people. These were leadership training programs. These were management training programs. What? You're breaking boards? What? You're screaming at the top of your lungs? What? You're dancing? What? You're never getting any sleep? Oh, but this is management training. People spent thousands and thousands of dollars on these courses, right? And then it spread into everything else, the self-help world, the wellness world, the sports world, what is it? Fix your body world, right? All of those places have also been taken over by some groups that are very cult-like. Some are run by cults. And of course, we must include the multi-level marketing scams. Some multi-level marketing companies apparently are legit. I've never quite got that, but many of them are not. So if any of you have watched LuLaRich in the last couple of weeks, you can see what that's like, and you can sort of see the cultic tendencies within that, where people had to dress alike and look alike and do whatever the leader did. And certainly in the wellness industry of vitamins and potions and oils, I mean, we just see it everywhere now. And people need to be really cautious. People need to be good consumers, like you don't buy the first car you look at. So why are you jumping on the first essential oil you look at, right? So do your research, see if there's any background material, read, just like with a car, you'd read consumer reports, you'd ask other people who own that car, you'd look at the criticisms. do that when you're signing up for anything, because it'll really help you. It'll really keep you out of some trouble and some deep rabbit holes.
Thank you. When someone, I know another part of your work has, part of it's been research, and you're a brilliant writer, and the other piece of what you do is working with people who have been in cults and their families. And I wondered if you could share a little bit with us about that process and how you kind of disengage from a cult.
Well, here's how I see it. I think everybody in a cult, unless they're a mini psychopath and want to be the leader when the leader dies or something like that, but everybody in a cult has doubts. And of course, you can't express those doubts. You know, it's not an environment where you can do that. So you shove all this stuff in the back of your head. And as I say, you have this shelf in the back of your head, right? And hopefully one day you're going to see, or you're going to be asked to participate, or you're going to read something or hear something, and it's going to be one more thing on that shelf, and that shelf is going to break. And then you'll have this aha moment. And you may not think it's a cult, but you will think, something's not right here. I'm not sure this is in my best interest. And you might start seeing things with new eyes. And then you might start thinking about leaving and making a plan for leaving. And depending on the group you're in, that's going to be easier or harder. So what I say to people on the outside, if you have someone in a cult or gone down one of these QAnon or anti-vaxxer or whatever rabbit holes, right? Don't challenge them. Don't be critical. Plant seeds on that shelf. So be very subtle and do what you can to get them to start thinking differently, whether that's with reminders of good times of the past, whether it's sending photos of, you know, their favorite dog when they were a kid, you know, whatever it might be. Plant seeds on that shelf and hope that that shelf breaks, and be the safe haven that they can go to if they want to leave, right? Because leaving one of these groups is one of the hardest things you're ever going to do, especially if you're alone, and especially if you have family in the group and you have to leave that on top of everything else. So you be that person they know they can come to. You're going to not bug them. You're not going to say, see, I told you so. You're going to let them sleep. If they want to talk, they can talk, and just let them decompress and help them in whatever way you can. That's the best I can offer. If I had a magic bullet, I'd be a millionaire.
I would think too. I know you mentioned that everyone is susceptible to cults and to this type of behavior. And I think it's a nice thing to mention that there may be shame and guilt that the person is carrying, that they fell for the cult's tactics. And, you know, I think that would be another aspect of recovery, of just regaining confidence in your own judgment after such an ordeal.
Yeah, absolutely. The stigma that former cult members or people who've suffered that kind of narcissistic abuse have to bear is still huge. I mean, I think we've gotten a little bit better in our society about domestic violence victims, you know, and we have shelters and we've trained the police and we have some better understanding. And I think we're doing better in sort of training people about sex trafficking victims or labor trafficking victims. And we're training the airline industry and the, you know, first responders and things like that. We haven't done that as a country for cults or people getting out of these coercive relationships in that way. And so there are no resources for people. Well, I shouldn't say no, I'm one resource, but there are very few resources for people when they come out of these situations. And they're lucky if they can find something. And if they've been born in a group and leave, you know, at whatever age, you know, they really have a long road to hoe because they don't know anything about the, you know, the outside world. So the trying to sort of get rid of that stigma is part of what I do in the public education that I do. but also in the, I work with two colleagues, and I've been leading Zoom courses for survivors of cults and abusive relationships. And, one of the things we focus on is the sort of shame and guilt that people carry with them, because there's always this, why didn't I leave sooner? How could I have allowed that to happen? How could I have watched that particular beating or whatever it is? How could I have done that to my best friend? There's just so much that people carry when they get out of those groups. And in fact, it as you say, it is such a huge factor that in our next round of courses, we're going to have a course solely on that, on what's called moral injury, or the ability to forgive oneself for having participated and having witnessed, and in some cases having been complicit, because it's all part of it, and all of that has to be undone. So it's a huge task.
Yeah. I have a question here from the chat. It seems as though therapists specializing in cults are either very expensive or they have very long wait times. However, there seems to be a lot of demand that's not being met. Have you noticed this, or is it a regional issue?
No, this is a huge issue. It's probably a worldwide issue. First of all, the therapists who understand it all about how to treat these kinds of survivors are few and far between. What's been identified as complex post-traumatic stress disorder is what survivors of cults and abusive relationships have. It's not what we know of as PTSD. It's called complex PTSD, and it's not recognized by most people in the therapy world or the psychiatric world, the psychological world. So there's just a few people who understand, who do this work. As I said, my colleagues and I are at the moment getting CEU credentials to be able to have courses to train therapists, which has also been a lifelong goal of mine. And I'm just ecstatic that this is finally happening before I croak, because I'm getting up there. But there's a huge need for this. And fortunately, there are, like the courses I lead, there are some Zoom groups, there are some therapists who are completely overbooked, absolutely. There are some support groups of former members. And of course, people always need to be careful, because sometimes it's hard for people. They trigger each other when they're in a context like that without a moderator. So yes, there's a lot of work to do to train therapists in this. And I'm just delighted. I was just asked to be part of a panel at the next American Psychiatric Association, which is huge. This is like an audience I never dreamed I'd ever be in front of. So little inroads are being made.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, never give up. And it's funny, because that seems, from the recovery standpoint, that's the audience that we would want to have that information. So
right.
Thank you for doing that, and for all the work that you've done in the field. I know a lot of the information that you have provided through your books has been new, and you come from having a direct experience, but also from a scholarly aspect as well. So it's a perfect combination for you to be doing exactly what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's look at some other questions here in the chat. What's the difference between this and a con? That's an interesting question.
Well, so I always say, I think most cult leaders are con artists, and they are. But I think a typical con, I would say, is somebody who is going to take you once, or maybe take you a few times, but they don't want to own you. The cult wants to own you, right? They want you working for them, whatever. They're going to re-socialize you so that you're serving the master. Whereas a con, might be the guy who says, I'm going to come do your windows, give me $500 deposit, and then he never comes back. Sort of the one-shot deal. Yeah, I think that's the simplest answer for that.
Yep, great. There's a question here. What books are you going to use apart from your own? And I'm assuming this is referring to the course that you're putting together, or maybe Patrick can clarify that.
Now, yeah. Well, I mean, we'll be using some of the material on trauma, for example, by, I have to look, what's her name? I'm sorry. See, I'm at that age. Jennifer, who knows what I'm talking about? She's very popular right now. I'm sorry. Oh, Janina Fisher. Work like that will probably reference Daniel Shaw, his work on traumatic narcissism. But, this will be Judith Herman, of course, Judith Herman. This will be probably, webinars. It's not going to be like a course where people will actually have to buy books and things like that. It'll more be kind of a webinar type training, and it's still, we're still formulating it. So I can't explain too much more than that right now. Sorry, Patrick.
Okay, we have another question here. I'm curious to hear you speak a little more on the relation of cults and being in long-term cluster B relationships, borderline or narcissistic personality disorder in a parent, friend, or colleague. So comparing more about being in a cult or being in these narcissistic kinds of relationships. Is there anything else you can share about that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about a romantic relationship or a family relationship, I think one difference might be, and probably is, that it's often far more difficult to leave. If you're in a if you're in a cult of any size, hopefully all the attention's not on you all the time. That's why smaller the cult, the harder it is for people to get away, because the cult leader's around all the time. My cult, even though it wasn't all that big, the core group was maybe 120 people. Some people never even met the leader or saw the leader, right? So, they could leave and it didn't make a big deal of difference. And sometimes they were just kicked out. But in these small family cults or cultic relationships, one-on-one relationships, it's obviously much more difficult to escape because the person's there all the time. They may be keeping you in a locked room for all you know, or, I don't know if any of you watched Surviving R. Kelly, the horrifying documentary, but, this is what he did. He had these girls enclosed in rooms, and they couldn't leave the room without permission. And they couldn't eat without permission. And if they did something wrong, they didn't eat for 3 days. I mean, thank God he finally got convicted. But so I think that's probably the biggest difference between a cult and a relationship or family, because there's much more focus on you. And so the trauma is perhaps far more intense.
Gotcha. That makes sense. There's another question here from Olivia, who asks or says, someone I know has been in a cult and her therapist says that therapists who do this work are in fear for their lives. Have you ever heard of them being targets?
Well, yes. Probably the most famous person was Dr. Margaret Singer, who was a clinical psychologist, who was the premier cult expert for many, many years, starting in the 70s. And she, I was a close colleague with her starting in the 90s and, wrote 2 books with her. She was harassed incessantly by a group I shall not name, whose name starts with an S. So you might want to think, and it's kind of a long name and it ends in ology. But they would, put rats in her house and cancel her airlines reservations or cancel her hotel reservations when she was going to a conference. And I don't know that she ever feared for her life, but it was constant harassment. And also, people have been sued by cults, myself included. I've been sued twice, which is not a pleasant experience. One was by a group called Landmark, formerly known as Est, and the other was a small group called the Fellowship of Friends in Northern California. So I don't think people fear for their life so much as, being harassed. I've been harassed online by these, what are they called? Not bots, but they're called something else where they bug you, trolls. So yeah, there is that, but I don't pay too much attention. I just do what I do.
Good. We're glad you're doing what you do.
I figure I've gotten this far, so.
Yeah. Let's see here. We're having some questions regarding specific organizations and whether or not they are cults. I don't know if you answer those kinds of questions.
What are they?
Do you consider MAGA a cult? MAGA.
Oh, MAGA. Well, MAGA, it was a national cultic movement. It was a type of a cult, unlike anything we've seen before. I mean, I think this whole last 4 to 6 years, we've seen cults on a national scale, and it's a little bit different than what we're used to with what I now call the run-of-the-mill cults. The brick and mortar. There's a headquarters. Where the leader is. Where everybody is. Now it's a little more amorphous because of the internet. Obviously, the head of the MAGA cult was Trump. And people behaved like they were in a cult, both those in government and his followers. And he had slogans and the paraphernalia and a lot of the trappings of a cult. So in a sense, yes, I guess I'd say yes.
Okay. As far as the law goes, are there any legal do's and don'ts for organizations regarding cult-like behahavier?
Do's and don'ts?
Yeah, I mean, is it
looking for advice?
Are cults? I guess it comes into the realm of when is it considered crossing legal boundaries, how these cults are behaving? Is it when it comes down to them actually committing a crime, or is there any legal information out there about organizations and ethics? And
well, no, I mean, it's not illegal per se to be a cult. And that's why it's difficult to hold them accountable. They have to commit crimes. They have to break the law in some way or another, whether it's tax evasion, hiding funds, other kinds of fraud, whatever that might be, killing people, physically harming people. Cults have done all that. So what's important is, I think if you're in a cult or someone in a cult is to gather evidence. I mean, the only way that, for example, the NXIVM cult in New York got busted was because they had reams and reams and reams of evidence that they could show to the federal authorities until they finally busted, Keith Raniere and his entourage, which took years. People tried for years to do that. The authorities are very reluctant to go after cults, in part because a lot of cults become religions and they think they can hide behind the First Amendment, and our courts don't want to deal with religion. And also legally yet in this country, we don't understand the concept of coercion. And that has happened now in the UK, where it is being applied to at least domestic relationships. It hasn't expanded yet to cults. But the idea that someone is doing something against their will, so to speak, they don't get it. I mean, I'm working with a man whose wife has given over $400,000 to some energy worker, and he's got evidence of all kinds of fraud. And when he went to the police, they said, Your wife is 42. If she wants to give him her money, that's her choice. No, she's completely lost her mind, but they don't see that part of it. So it's really, really difficult to try to hold those groups accountable. And it's also difficult for former members to sue, for example, because then they have to go through discovery and depositions and taking the stand. And that is so painful that a lot of people just don't want to go through that again.
Gotcha. Yeah. We have a question here from Chris asking, are there existing trainings or therapy models for therapists specializing in supporting survivors of power and control in interpersonal relationships who suffer from complex PTSD, similar to what you described, you will be doing in the training for therapists? And yeah, so they want to know if there are existing therapy models for therapists that can be used in the training module that you are creating. Is there a certain model that you're looking at? Or that
I don't think there's one specific model. I think for me, good old talk therapy is always the best, and not talking about what happened when you were 2 years old, but debriefing yourself of your cult experience is the first thing you need to do with a client. And then I think one of the things we do in our courses is one of my colleagues is a trauma therapist, but also a specialist in dialectical behavioral therapy, which has incredible numbers of skills that help people when they're having a panic attack or an anxiety attack, or feel like they're trancing out or whatever. So learning those types of DBT skills, I think, would be helpful for anyone working with someone. Obviously, and I don't say this to toot my horn, but I think my book, Take Back Your Life, should be required reading. It's really kind of a classic at this point about cult recovery, as well as Escaping Utopia for those who were born in a cult. And then there are some excellent workbooks out. Janina Fisher has a workbook. There's a complex PTSD workbook. There's other trauma workbooks that I think can also be very helpful in working with clients.
Okay, thank you. I do want to mention this. I know just in some of my own studies on religion and religious groups that in the past there have been references to small religious groups that would be considered cults, but there has never seemed to be any issue that the members have. In other words, are all cults bad?
Well, according to my definition, cults exist on a continuum from somewhat benign to extremely harmful. Now, the somewhat benign could be, I don't know, the chocolate chip cookie cult. I don't know, could be some, commune that's gotten a little culty. But for me, part of the definition of a cult and part of the requirement of being a cult member is giving up your autonomy, giving up your individuality and your sense of self. And so that can't ever be good as far as I'm concerned. You don't ever want to give that away, right? That's precious. Your mind is precious. Your thoughts are precious. And who you are is precious. Who you are and who you want to be, not who someone else wants you to be. So even the more benign cults, in my opinion, are it could be worse, but I still wouldn't go there, and I wouldn't send my children there if I had any.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers it, but I feel strongly about that. Otherwise, what makes it a cult, right?
Right. Yeah, I think I was kind of thinking of more historical documents or historical accounts of, oh, back in the day, there were all of these different, yoga cults or, different from a historical viewpoint. I don't know why they would be calling it a cult if they didn't for sure know how the power dynamic was, and
right.
we're talking about, stuff that's 4,000 years old, or, you
Right.
know.
And I think some people use the words cult and sect interchangeably. And a
Yes.
sect is a breakoff from an established religion, right? So that somebody's broke off from the Presbyterians and became something else. And then they were called a sect for a while until they got bigger, and then they were an established religion. So back in the day, there were probably lots of sects, and there were, there were these cults in the ancient days that worshiped goddesses and this and that, and they were called cults because of their intense devotion to that goddess or god figure. But I think at that time, people weren't looking for the power dynamic. So my concern is contemporary cults.
Sure. Yep. That makes sense. We have a question here as well from Mary. I was raised third generation in a religious cult, escaped that by joining the military, another cult. And when I retired from the military, I jumped right into another cult, an MLM, multi-level marketing company, for those who don't know. It wasn't until this year, I'm 47 years old, as I have, sorry about my scrolling, 47 years old, as I have been unpacking the traumas I experienced in the military, that I came to realize I've spent my entire life in one cult or another. Now I'm trying to figure out who I am and what my beliefs are. Thank you for all the work you are doing.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And whoever you are, I want to tell everybody, we have a Facebook page called Take Back Your Life Recovery Facebook page, or Take Back Your Life Recovery at gmail.com. And if you're interested in being on any of our lists, either for our therapy trainings or for our survivor groups, that'll be starting again after the first of the year, please email or go to our Facebook page and let us know, and we'll put you on the waiting list, because our mission is to help people. And there are so many people like you, I don't know your name, who asked that question, but I'm sure you have a shitload of stuff to deal with, and we'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, if we're able to connect the two of you, it's well worth this program right there. So I wanted to also mention, someone had asked here in the chat about the Zoom calls that you mentioned, some other Zoom calls. I don't remember if you were saying they were trainings that would be coming up, or support groups. I can't remember.
The Zoom, the courses that we lead are on Zoom. We call them learning series, but they're on Zoom. Is that what we're referring to? And those start up again after the first of the year.
Okay, great. And can people find out about that on your website as well?
Yes, on my website or on the Take Back Your Life Recovery Facebook page. Yes. And people can email me through my website if they want to make contact with me individually.
Okay. Wonderful. Do we have any other questions while we are here with Janja?
I'd like to thank everyone for being here. This is really, really a pleasure for me. Oh my gosh, I see there's a second page. Can I go over and look at the second page? Are there more people over there? Oh my goodness. So thank you everyone for being here, and also to the few people here I know. It's good to see you. And thank you, Jessica, for setting this up. I've really been looking forward to this. So thank you for approaching me.
Yeah, no problem. It's wonderful to have you, and thank you for being here again. I do want to, before we go, share some other upcoming programs that the Interfaith Center is offering. These are all Zoom programs. They're all free, and you can find those on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. If you ever miss one, they're always recorded and they're always available on the YouTube channel after the fact. So look us up there on YouTube. We're the Interfaith Center at Miami University is our YouTube channel. So next week on October 12th, we have Spiritual But Not Religious with Linda Mercadante. On October 19th, we have a just announced program that I'm really excited about with Kim Ogle, and it's called Living with Grief from COVID-19. So we'll be talking about individual loss as well as societal loss, meaning not just deaths, but also non-death losses that we'll be discussing. And then on November 9th, we have a class called Values-Driven Marketing with Kylie Slavic. So we'll be looking at conscious marketing, it would be another way of saying that, or marketing that's driven by your own personal values and how you can establish values to operate by for your business as well. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. I hope to see you all again soon, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Bye, everybody.